In 2019, President Donald Trump sparked a diplomatic firestorm when he suggested purchasing Greenland. At the time, many dismissed it as a mere joke, a fleeting whim of an unpredictable leader. But here we are in 2025, and the seriousness of his intentions has become impossible to ignore. Greenland, a cold, remote island, has suddenly become the center of a geopolitical storm that could shake the very foundations of the NATO alliance. What does this mean for Europe, for Denmark, and for the future of global diplomacy? This is not just about a piece of land, it's about the very principles that bind the world's most powerful military alliance. The European response to this challenge will determine if NATO's unity will survive. Can Europe defend its sovereignty, or will the world see a shift in power that challenges the balance of international relations? It's time to take a closer look at what's really at stake. In the midst of an ever-evolving geopolitical landscape, one thing has become clear. Greenland is no longer just a remote territory of strategic interest. It has transformed into a symbol of something much bigger: territorial sovereignty, international law, and the credibility of global alliances. For decades, Greenland has maintained a delicate balance between its ties to Denmark and its aspirations for self-determination. The United States has long had a military presence on the island, but the idea of annexing it is a stark departure from any previous understanding. This move isn't just about military strategy, it's about undermining the very notion of sovereignty. In the eyes of Europe, the US seeking to annex Greenland would cross a red line. It would violate Danish sovereignty, strip away Greenland's self-determination, and mark a breach of international law that would leave the NATO alliance in tatters. The consequences of such an action would not just be diplomatic, they would strike at the core of what NATO stands for: mutual respect, defense of sovereignty, and the preservation of international law. How will Europe respond when its own values are on the line? The story of Greenland's strategic importance begins long before Trump's suggestion to purchase the island. For years, the island has been a key player in the global balance of power, particularly during the Cold War, when it served as a critical outpost for NATO, especially with its air bases and missile defense systems. But history has also shown how delicate the politics surrounding Greenland are. Denmark and Greenland share a long history, one marked by a colonial past and complex relationships with international powers. Greenland, though an autonomous territory, remains connected to Denmark, navigating the fine line between maintaining its sovereignty and addressing the strategic demands of larger powers. So why now? In the years leading up to Trump's presidency, Greenland became more valuable than ever. As Arctic ice melts and new trade routes open, the region is becoming a new frontier for natural resources and military importance. The US has long had a vested interest in the region's security, but Trump's push to outright annex Greenland is a game changer. It's no longer just about securing a strategic position, it's about power and control, and that poses a direct challenge to Europe. In the face of Trump's relentless pursuit of Greenland, Europe found itself thrust into a crisis it hadn't fully anticipated. The first sign of this came in the form of a geopolitical shockwave, a sudden announcement that US military assets would be further expanded in Greenland, regardless of Denmark's objections. The reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a diplomatic issue, it was an existential threat to Europe's understanding of territorial integrity and NATO's credibility. European leaders, initially dismissing Trump's threats, quickly realized they were dealing with a much more serious and unpredictable scenario. The US was no longer negotiating in good faith. It was trying to dictate the future of a sovereign territory with no regard for international norms. In an attempt to placate the Trump administration, European leaders offered a greater NATO presence in the Arctic, increased US military assets, and even economic deals. But these efforts fell short. Nothing short of total submission seemed to satisfy the US demands. And then the question started. What would the cost of caving be for Europe? Would it risk breaking the very alliances that kept the continent secure for decades? As the tension escalated, it became evident that the real motive behind Trump's desire for Greenland wasn't just about securing a strategic military outpost or gaining access to its resources. It was about asserting dominance, about power and control over a critical region in the world's most volatile geopolitical landscape. To fully understand this, we must peel back the layers of the U.S. strategy. Greenland isn't simply a military asset or a geographical position. It is a symbolic prize that would shift the global power dynamics in favor of the United States. By annexing Greenland, Trump would not only challenge European authority, but also undermine the very principles of self-determination and sovereignty that underpin the international order. This goes beyond economics. It's about challenging the balance of power and the very foundation of NATO itself. The U.S. government's rhetoric around military buildup and economic concessions may sound reasonable at first, but these are distractions, misleading justifications for a much deeper game. Europe is being forced to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that the U.S. is prepared to use its might to reshape the global map, regardless of the cost. The stakes are high, and for Europe the cost of failure could be nothing less than the unraveling of NATO. The second crisis in this saga unfolded when the U.S. intensified its demands, taking a more aggressive stance toward Greenland. The situation reached a boiling point when President Trump hinted that the U.S. could employ economic measures, including tariffs, to force Denmark's hand. The European response was swift, but the stakes had already been raised. In an already fragile diplomatic climate, Europe now had to balance two priorities: avoiding a direct confrontation with the U.S. while maintaining the integrity of NATO. As European leaders scrambled to respond, the once dismissed threats were becoming a very real concern. This was the moment when Europe had to decide, would they allow the U.S. to march forward with its plans, or would they take a stand? And so the world held its breath. Would Europe yield to the U.S., or would it unite to defend the sovereignty of Denmark and Greenland? The tension mounted, the clock was ticking, and every move mattered. As the U.S. flexed its economic muscle, Europe had no choice but to consider the consequences of standing up to the most powerful nation in the world. As the geopolitical crisis over Greenland unfolded, the impact on ordinary citizens was profound. For the people of Denmark and Greenland, the looming threat of U.S. annexation wasn't just a political matter, it was personal. The sovereignty of their homeland was at stake, and their future hung in the balance. The people of Greenland in particular faced the harsh reality of their right to self-determination being undermined by a foreign power. For them, the idea of being swept up in a geopolitical game with their future decided by distant leaders was nothing short of heartbreaking. In Denmark, the government found itself in the unenviable position of protecting both its sovereignty and its people's interests. The threat from the U.S. was no longer just an abstract issue, it was a tangible reality with deep emotional consequences. For Europeans, this crisis was a reminder of the stakes in global politics. This wasn't just about territory, it was about the values that define Europe: freedom, self-determination, and respect for international law. The message was clear: Europe had to come together. The people of Denmark, Greenland, and the wider European community needed to stand united to send a powerful message that they would not let their sovereignty be trampled. As the standoff over Greenland unfolded, the ripples of this crisis reached far beyond the shores of Europe. The U.S. move to annex the island wasn't just a regional issue, it had profound global implications, shaking the foundations of international diplomacy. The territorial ambitions of the U.S. would send a signal to other nations that borders, sovereignty, and international law are no longer sacred. This would embolden other powers to reconsider their own territorial claims, undermining the very fabric of the global order that has kept the peace for decades. Beyond Europe, the impact of a U.S. annexation of Greenland would be felt across the globe. nations that depend on the stability of international law, such as those in the South China Sea, would see this as a green light to pursue their own expansionist goals. The world would be forced to reckon with a new era of unchecked power grabs, the geopolitical balance would shift, and NATO's credibility would be shattered. How could the alliance continue to function when its most powerful member was willing to trample on the sovereignty of another member? This was more than a regional crisis. It was a warning shot for the future of global order. As Europe braces for the potential fallout from this crisis, the future is uncertain. What will happen next? There are three possible scenarios that could unfold, each with its own consequences for Europe, the US, and the global community. The best-case scenario, Europe and the US find a way to resolve the standoff diplomatically, the annexation of Greenland is averted, and NATO remains united. In this scenario, Europe emerges as a strong, unified force, reaffirming its commitment to sovereignty and international law. The transatlantic relationship is salvaged, and the US recognizes the importance of respecting the territorial integrity of its allies. The middle ground. The crisis drags on, but Europe manages to contain the worst of the fallout. While Greenland remains in play, a diplomatic solution emerges that allows Europe to avoid full confrontation. This outcome would still result in a weakening of NATO and strained relations between Europe and the US, but the alliance may survive, albeit with deep scars. The worst-case scenario, the US proceeds with the annexation of Greenland, and Europe stands powerless to stop it. The result would be catastrophic for NATO, signaling the collapse of the alliance as a credible institution. Europe would be forced to reckon with a new world order, one where its sovereignty is no longer guaranteed and its security is no longer assured. The loss of Greenland would be the loss of Europe's position in the global power hierarchy. The future of Europe depends on how it responds now. Will it stand firm or will it concede to a future shaped by unchecked power? As we reach the end of this crisis, one thing is clear: Europe cannot afford to let this moment pass quietly into history. The threats to Greenland and the very fabric of NATO have exposed a fundamental truth. Europe must take control of its own destiny. For too long, Europe has been caught in the shadows of US power, relying on the protection and support of a country that may no longer have its best interests at heart. But now, as the future of NATO hangs in the balance, Europe has a choice. It can either succumb to the pressure of an unpredictable president, or it can rise together, united in defense of sovereignty, law, and democracy. This is not just about Greenland, it's about the future of Europe's place in the world. The message to President Trump is clear: Europe will not stand by while its sovereignty is threatened. And to the people of Europe, this is your moment to ensure that your future is one of independence, respect, and security. The road ahead is uncertain, but one thing is certain: Europe must act now before it's too late. The future of NATO, of Europe, and of the global order rests on the choices we make today.